For those of you who don't know me, my name is Noreen Tomassi, and I'm the director of the Center for Fiction. And I want to begin this evening with a little background. First of all, I would like to thank the National Endowment for the Arts, who was so positive about our proposal for this series. They've been very interested in the links between creativity and neuroscience, and supported some years ago a conference that took place at the Santa Fe Institute on this topic. And out of that came a paper by Cormac McCarthy that I read. I've been wildly interested in the topic because it seemed to me like such unknowable territory to so many of us. And it's a territory that is especially interesting to people who are interested in literature, both writers and readers. So the idea for the series, Synapse, came out of that interest. And we were lucky enough also to partner with YHouse and Eric Howell, who has helped us very much in organizing these events. And we're very lucky to have our two speakers tonight, who I will introduce in a second. I just want to catch you up. Our first event in the series was done in collaboration with the Princeton Social Neuroscience Lab, and in that they talked about a study that was done on creatives and non-creatives to identify whether their brains functioned differently in the creative act. What they basically found was the answer to that, based on the MRIs and the tests they did between a group of creatives and a group of non-creatives, was, wouldn't it be so distressing to be asked to join that group? But in any case, they found that yes, their brains did function quite differently in the act of creation. They were not just using the same parts of their brain differently, they were using different parts of their brain. So that was fascinating. And then next we had Charles Gross. We had Charles Gross from Princeton, along with, wait, I don't think I can talk while I do this. Can't do two things at once, but I'm going to work on that with And he and his wife, Joyce Carol Oates, talked about how the brain functions when we see and how writers use the visual in their work and how their perception, their sight, the actual physical sight, influences them as writers and not just influences the writers, but it's determinative in how they recount their experience of the world. So that was really fascinating as well. And that brings us to tonight, where we have two very distinguished people on stage with me. And I'll tell you about what they're going to discuss, but I just want to remind you that there's one other event in which we will have Rebecca Brockman and Adam Hazlitt talking about how we inherit, and that is the biological roots of depression and whether there could be a vaccine for depression and how the brain functions in familial inheritance of depression. But tonight, we're going to be talking about love. And the people who are going to be talking about it, I hope you've read a little bit about them, but are Garth Greenwell, who is the author of What Belongs to You, which was winner of the British Book Award for Debut of the Year. The novel was longlisted for the National Book Award and was a finalist for 6 other awards, including the Lambda Literary Award, the PEN/Faulkner Award, the James Tate Black Memorial Prize, and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. It was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice, was named a Best Book in 2016 by over 50 publications in 9 countries, and is being translated into 11 languages. His short fiction has appeared in the Paris Review, A Public Space, and Vice, and he has written criticism for the New Yorker, the London Review of Books, and the New York Times Book Review, etc., etc. He lives and teaches in Iowa City. and I feel very lucky to know him. So welcome back to the center, Garth. Lucy Brown, PhD, is a neuroscientist and clinical professor in neurology at Einstein College of Medicine in New York. She received her PhD in experimental physiological psychology from NYU in 1973. During a postdoctoral fellowship at Einstein, she worked on visualizing dopamine neurons and testing their plasticity in reward systems. She also learned about functional brain mapping techniques during the fellowship and continued at Einstein as a grant-funded investigator. She was director of the Laboratory for Functional Neuroanatomy and Movement Disorders for over 20 years. Her area of expertise is the neuroanatomy of the somatosensory and motor systems. Together with Art Aaron and Helen Fisher, she pioneered studies of the neuroscience of romantic love. These studies have had clinical relevance as we begin to better understand drug addiction and depression after heartbreak. Currently, she collaborates with several investigators on brain imaging of how love, personality traits, and mobility and cognition operate in normal aging. So we're going to begin the evening with a reading by Garth from What Belongs to You. And then Lucy will explain a little bit about her work, and then we'll have a conversation followed by questions from the audience. Questions only, please, no statements. And then we will have wine to drink and books for sale. And I hope you'll have an opportunity to talk to both these brilliant people one-on-one at that time. So Garth, ready?
Yeah. Can you hear me all right? Yes. Microphone okay? So I feel quite intimidated. So, I mean, this is a book I think, although this is kind of, not all readers have felt this way, but to me, it is a love story. And so, you know, in some sense, I feel like, oh, I talk about love all the time. But now I'm on stage with someone who actually knows, like, something. And so I talk about my feelings, and you're going to talk about, like, reality.
They're the same.
So, and I've kind of selected 4 paragraphs, the point of which, you know what, can I try just without the microphone?
Yeah.
Sure.
If we're not recording, can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. In a previous life, I was a singer, an opera singer, and I think microphones still resent me.
Don't worry about it, Garth.
Maybe,
She can control it there.
yeah, just make it be quiet. Okay, so I'm going to read 4 paragraphs, and hopefully the book is, as I say, a love story about a relationship between an American teacher living and teaching in Sofia, Bulgaria, and a younger Bulgarian man whom he meets in a cruising bathroom beneath the National Palace of Culture and whom he pays for sex. I'm going to read 4 paragraphs that kind of sketch out this relationship, I hope in a way that will not require any more context than that. I'm going to read the first paragraph of the book. I'm going to read a paragraph from the first night that the two of them spend together in the narrator's apartment. And I want to say that it's kind of extraordinary to be here with Lucy, because kind of my favorite image in the book was taken from my memory of a 2005 New York Times article about the neuroscience of love that focused on Lucy's work. So it's wonderful to sort of bring this full. That was long. I had no idea I was going to write a novel in 2005. I just read this article and felt like, here is the sign. Here is what poets have been talking about since the dawn of time. And then I'm going to read 2 paragraphs from the final scene of the book, which happens 3 years later, and it's when these 2 characters say goodbye to each other. That my first encounter with Mikko B ended in a betrayal, even a minor one, should have given me greater warning at the time, which should in turn have made my desire for him less, if not done away with it completely. But warning, in places like the bathrooms at the National Palace of Culture where we met, is like some element coterminous with the air, ubiquitous and inescapable, so that it becomes part of those who inhabit it and thus part and parcel of the desire that draws us there. Even as I descended the stairs, I heard his voice, which, like the rest of him, was too large for those subterranean rooms, spilling out of them as if to climb back into the bright afternoon that, though it was mid-October, had nothing autumnal about it. The grapes that hung ripe from vines throughout the city burst warm still in one's mouth. I was surprised to hear someone talking so freely in a place where by unstated code voices seldom rose above a whisper. At the bottom of the stairs, I paid my 50 stotinki to an old woman who looked up at me from her booth, her expression unreadable as she took the coins. With her other hand, she clutched a shawl against the chill that was constant here, whatever the season. Only as I neared the end of the corridor did I hear a second voice, not raised like the first, but answering in a low murmur. The voices came from the second of the bathroom's 3 chambers, where they might have belonged to men washing their hands had the sound of water accompanied them. I paused in the outermost room, examining myself in the mirrors lining its walls as I listened to their conversation, though I couldn't understand a word. There was only one reason for men to be standing there. The bathrooms at Indica, as the palace is called, are well enough hidden and have such a reputation that they're hardly used for anything else. And yet as I turned into the room, this explanation seemed at odds with the demeanor of the man who claimed my attention, which was cordial and brash, entirely public in that place of intense privacies. I set the book aside, seeing that Mikko was tired too, tired and noticeably drunk. He had emptied nearly 2/3 of the bottle we had bought. He was unsteady on his feet when he stood up, having said goodbye to the man in Plovdiv and having announced his intention, finally, to sleep. There were 3 hours left until we would have to wake. He for his short trip to Plovdiv, a couple of hours on a comfortable bus, and I for a day of teaching, when I would stand before my class wearing a face scrubbed of the eagerness and servility and need it wore as I followed Mikko to the bathroom. Standing behind him, he was still naked as he stood to piss. I rubbed his chest and stomach, lean and taut, the skin of my hands catching just slightly on the bristles of hair, and then, at his words of permission or encouragement, something like, "Go on, I don't mind," my hands went lower, and gingerly I took the base of his cock and wrapped my hand around the shaft, feeling beneath my fingers the flow of water, heavy and urgent, and feeling too my own urgency, the hardness I pressed against him. He leaned his head back, pressing his face against mine, rubbing it. It too was stubbled and rough against the softness of my own, and I felt him harden as he finished pissing, as I carefully skinned him back and shook the last of it, feeling almost suffocated with longing, having never touched anyone in that way before, having never before been of that particular service. Mikko turned to me and kissed me, deeply and searchingly and possessingly, at the same time pushing me backward down the hallway toward the bedroom, pushing me and perhaps also using me for support to the broad bed where we had lain together earlier and where now we lay down again. He wrapped his arms around me and pulled me close to him. And not just his arms, he wrapped his legs around me too, and with all 4 of his limbs pressed me to him, embracing me so that when I breathed in, the air was filtered through him, smelling of alcohol, of course, but also of his own scent that elicited such an animal response from me, that so fired me up. I imagined the chambers of the brain lighting up, thrown switches in a house. He lay like some marine creature wrapped around me, wrapping around me again if I shifted or half woke, and I slept as I have seldom slept, deeply and almost without disturbance, held like his beloved or his child, or held, I suppose it must be said, like his captive or his prey. Mite, I said, using again my favorite name for him, his nighest name, or the nighest to me. "I'm sorry, it's time for you to go." And as I spoke the words, I found that I was sorry, knowing that I would truly be rid of him now. "Yes," he said, agreeing, "Trudvamsi." But he didn't get up to go. He remained perched on the edge of the couch, his hand on the cup of yogurt he had emptied. I got up and took my wallet from my coat, which was hanging beside the door. The bus to Varna would be 30 leva, or had been not long before, so I took out twice that, and then a little more, and folded the notes until they were a tight coil in my palm. Here, I said, holding this out to him. This will get you to Varna, and there's money for food. He looked at the money I held out, but didn't move to take it, as if his unfocused gaze didn't quite recognize what it saw. Here, I said again, you should go to Varna. You should be with your mother. He nodded at this. He wiped his hands on his jeans and then took the money from me and stood up. He was visibly better now. He wasn't quite steady, but he didn't stumble. Merci, he said, nothing more, as he slid the money into his pocket. Then he turned and carefully picked up his crumpled jacket, putting it on slowly, not just out of a need to manage his resources, I thought, but out of a reluctance to leave, so that even as he said again, Trudvamsi, he made no movement toward the door. He went to the refrigerator instead, pulling it open and peering inside. I'm still hungry, he said. I'll just fry an egg before I go. Pet minuti, he said, 5 minutes. But I stepped toward him and put my hand on his shoulder. Mitko, I said, I'm sorry, I have to sleep. You can eat somewhere else, you have enough for that. And again I did feel sorry. I felt cruel forcing him to leave, though I had fed him and given him money. What would it mean to do enough, I wondered, as I had wondered before about that obligation to others that sometimes seems so clear and sometimes disappears altogether, so that now we owe nothing, anything we give is too much, and now our debt is beyond all counting. And this is the last paragraph, which I realize I've never read before. Mitko has just left. I turned off the lights, wanting to be in darkness or near darkness. It's never truly dark in Mladost. It's only ever twilight with the lights from the street and from the windows of neighboring buildings. And then I crossed back through the main room and stepped out onto the balcony. It was a crisp night, with a spring chill so different from fall or winter, not in its temperature, but in the quality of the air, its softness or tenderness, what has always seemed to me like its welcome. It was late, but not terribly late. The moon was in the middle of the sky, the only natural light where it hung above the Blokove. I could hear the traffic on Malinov, and there were 2 cars coming down my own street, one of which pulled into a gap at the curb to park, drawing itself up on the sidewalk and letting its lights go dark. I heard the closing of the building's door down below, the loud sound it made when pushed open and allowed to swing back freely, a discourteous sound. And then Mitko came into view, walking not quickly but with purpose, not steadily but without risk of tumbling over. He was shaking the cup of yogurt, holding it close to his ear as if fascinated by the sound it made. Ahead of him, the car doors opened, and a young couple stepped out, fashionably dressed, returning from dinner, I suppose. The woman closed her own door and then opened the one behind, bending down to occupy herself with a child, extracting it from its buckles and straps and then rising up again with it in her arms. It was a little girl, I thought, judging from her clothes rather than from any features I could make out, and she was sleeping. Her body was limp in her mother's arms. Mitko slowed his pace as he approached them, looking at the little girl with interest, the yogurt still raised to his ear, though he had stopped shaking it, and I saw him lean toward the child a little, saying something, though of course I couldn't make out the words. I had witnessed this many times here, the freedom with which people addressed small children, leaning in as Mitko did now, calling them milichka, sweetness, as I imagined him doing. No one took offense, as though it were granted that children were a kind of public property, something to be cherished in common. There was a crisis. Every few months there were alarming articles in the newspapers about the falling birth rate. Though there were many children in my neighborhood, the country as a whole was imperiled. People couldn't afford children, or they saw no point in having them. And as everyone who has the chance flees abroad, like my own students, I thought, who are so eager to escape, the population declines, and the warnings in the papers grow more strident, and the nation itself becomes a little less real, fading away, some fear, to nothing. There's no hope for it, some of my students have said, not in class but in private, whispering as though it shouldn't be said out loud. It is a dying country. Small children are a shared joy then. Their parents bask in it, the stroked cheeks and milichkas. But this mother didn't welcome Mitko's joy at the sight of the child. She turned from him just slightly, not rudely, but insistently, as if shielding the girl from his interest, and then the father was beside them, ushering them toward their building's door. Mitko stood for a moment, as if perplexed, and again I was filled with grief for him, seeing him standing alone on the street. He had always been alone, I thought, gazing at a world in which he had never found a place and that was now almost perfectly indifferent to him. He was incapable even of disturbing it, of making a sound it could be bothered to hear. Suddenly I was enraged for him. I felt the anger I was sure he must feel, that futile anger like a dry grinding of gears. But from a distance, Mitko didn't seem to feel anything at all. These were only my own thoughts, I knew. They brought me no nearer him. This man I had in some sense loved, and who had never, in the years I had known him, been anything but alien to me. He set off again, shaking the cup of yogurt he had never lowered from his ear, and I watched him until he turned out of sight, headed toward the boulevard and the bus that would carry him away. I stood there for some time, gazing at the corner from which he had vanished. Then I stepped inside, and sitting where he had been just a moment before beside me, I lowered my face into my hands. Thank you.
That was gorgeous. Amazing. And so now we turn to Lucy, who will tell us a little bit about her work.
So, Garth, it's great to hear those passages read out loud. And it's very moving, and there are certainly a lot of complex emotions there, and so many emotions. But what I want to do just for a few minutes here with you is tell you a little bit about my experience as a neuroscientist with a group of people discovering, identifying the neural systems underlying early stage, intense romantic love. It was about 18 years ago now that we were sitting around planning these experiments. And this wasn't so easy 18 years ago, by the way. You probably all know about the amygdala and emotion, and Joe Ledoux was just beginning those experiments, and to even begin to say you were going to study something like emotion or romantic love, which isn't necessarily that clinically important, so the NIH thinks. Anyway, so we were it was a unique collaboration. It was Helen Fisher, a biological anthropologist, who has the perspective of evolution, which is a very interesting one in this case. It was myself as a neuroscientist with some expertise in the dopamine system and the reward system, and a neuroanatomist and someone who had experience with doing brain imaging. And then Art Aaron, a social psychologist at Stony Brook. And Art was very important to me. So you have to know that I met Helen at a meeting, and she started saying to me, I would really like to study the brain systems of romantic love. She has this idea, it's a good one, of the strategy that we use as humans for reproduction. The human reproductive strategy involves lust, sex, we all know what that is, attraction, this focusing on one person, romantic love, and attachment, and how this accomplishes reproduction, and so we procreate, but also protection of the individual. And she thought that these were three separate behavioral systems, and there would be three separate brain systems for this. It took me a while to be convinced by Helen, but she did convinced me this was, an important thing to study. I mean, we change our lives around romantic love and who we fall in love with, It totally, some people fly from coast to coast on the weekend, but that's not all. I mean, people die for love. And so what was most important was Art Aaron, as a social psychologist, had been studying psychology and the behaviors really carefully and quantifying them. So here I am, I'm a bench scientist. I like to quantify things. And Art told me there was something called the passionate love scale. Yes, passionate love scale. You mean we can put a number on some of these people's attitudes and feelings? Okay, I'm in. So we started planning. And our prediction was that probably, because we all felt that romantic love was a little bit like being addicted to a drug, like nicotine, which many of us know about that addiction. And there were studies being done at that time, because they were medically relevant, on drug addiction, brain scanning studies, say at NIH. And they were finding that it was this dopaminergic system, and they were identifying a part of the brain that happens to be called the nucleus accumbens that was associated with the addiction feelings. So when addicts saw the paraphernalia of drugs, this part of the brain would become active. We said, romantic love is very much like an addiction, so we had a good rationale that this part of the brain would be involved. But who knew? Some people said to us, everyone's different. You'll never find the same part of the brain, in everyone that's involved in romantic love. But I was interested in natural euphoria, identifying in humans and the systems for natural euphoria. Here other people were studying drug-induced euphoria. Should I take this off also?
No, I think
okay.
you're fine.
So, and Art was good. Art said, he'd been studying love a long time, and he said, I don't think this is just an emotion. I think it's more motivation. And Helen and I were at first, like, what does he mean? But as you will hear, he was right. But how do you study romantic love in people who are lying in an MRI machine, this great big thing that's around? If any of you have had an MRI, even of a broken wrist or a broken ankle, let alone of the head, you're in there, you've got a small space, it's noisy, and you have like half an hour, you have a stimulus that's on for 20 seconds, then off, then another stimulus, a control stimulus, on for 20 seconds, then off. How are you going to do this? Well, it actually took a couple of years to decide how to do this. But what we did was we had people bring in a headshot of their romantic partner. So as primates, we find the face very important. It's very important to us. So people would look at the face. We asked them to look at the face of their romantic partner and think romantic thoughts for 20 seconds while they're in this machine. And there's a mirror up here. And you know what? People are so in love, and they look at that picture and they don't hear the machine. So the thing is, so what do you use as a control stimulus? Do you use, so you want a face, a human face? How about the picture of George Washington? No. We need a face that's familiar, all right, to the person. So one of the subjects lived in New York City and, saw their doorman every day. Right? So they brought that face in as a control stimulus. And so the idea that what you have to do is you want to see the specificity of the brain response to the romantic partner. So you have to subtract out all of the brain's responses to a face. As if any of you were here for Charlie Gross, he was the discoverer of the face cells in the human in the primate cortex. and just a familiar person, and just having memories about a person. So, but then here we are, so it's 20 seconds on, 20 seconds off, for the, and then 20 seconds for the control stimulus, but we're asking these people to think about their most romantic moment, you know, with this romantic partner. How do we get them to turn it off so we can have a control time? Well, this took some time to figure out, but I have a way that you can, if you're obsessed with some thought and you want to stop thinking about it, I've got a way. We put up a number like 1011 and said to people, count back by sevens from that number. All right, and it works. All right, it really works. So it was, the way the experiment goes is a picture comes up of the romantic partner, and then count back by sevens from 1011 or some other number, and then the, as we call them, the familiar neutral, and then count back again by seven, and that's repeated several times. And then the experiment's over. So, you know, I will actually never forget the only time, the time I know where I was sitting. We had to do this work, by the way, on weekends and at night, because, as I said, who was going to fund this? But so when I was sitting and at my old computer then, you know, an old laptop at home on a Sunday, and looked and saw the group data. And it was an amazing moment. So here's a little neuroanatomy for you. So here's a model of the brain, right, going like this. And here's the brain. Here's the brain stem. All right, the stem of the flower. Nice, right? And this part, the flower, this is what makes us really uniquely human. It's so complex, all these folds, things like that. But this part of the brain, the stem, we share the circuits and the cells there, and the basic functions are very similar to other animals, from prairie voles to rats. You know, this part is certainly more mammalian and even vertebrate. So when I was kind of, and this is where the nucleus accumbens was, still in the forebrain, you know, kind of between this brainstem area and the cortex. So we were predicting this forebrain area, the nucleus accumbens. But what I saw was an area even more primitive than that nucleus accumbens, rich in dopamine. Actually, the little factory for the dopamine cells in this, it's called the ventral tegmental area. It's here in this brainstem. Know that this area controls things like swallowing, standing up against gravity, things that we take for granted, that we don't even think about. You know, this is speak of nonverbal or unconscious level. And you have these cells here, these dopaminergic cells. You don't realize that you need a system that tells you that water tastes good when you're thirsty. You need a system that tells you what doesn't taste good too when you're thirsty. Or, you know, that chocolate tastes good, okay? So this is at the reflex level of the brain. And this rewards and drive system. Drive. So the way, and what I knew as a neuroscientist, I said, this is the basic stuff. You know, this is our the other person is a goal in your life. The way I think about romantic love now, it's not so much as an emotion. Emotions come and go. Romantic love involves anxiety. This is a survival system, really. This is a natural addiction system. The drugs of abuse jump onto this natural system that we have, that nature gave us, that evolved. I now think of romantic love as a developed form of a mammalian drive to pursue preferred mates. All right? And that it's a survival system, it's an addiction. We need this addiction. We need an addiction to water or food, because you can't just say, oh, I'm not going to drink today. You have to drink water. And as a matter of fact, and it's these same systems that are involved in romantic love for all of us. This is the core system. We did these studies in Beijing too. We need to be addicted to each other. Yeah. It's, we need each other for protection. It's not just for reproduction. It's for protection of the individual too. When you have a partner walking down the streets in New York City, you've got a little extra safety there. Not to mention 2 incomes. But so it's a whole different way. These data really gave us a whole different way of thinking about love, and as a survival system, as a natural addiction system. And as I said, these studies, we've reproduced them. Other people have reproduced this result. We've reproduced it at least 10 times in studies. You don't need a group effect to show this. Documentary filmmakers have come to ask us to scan someone and then look at the results. As long as they bring us someone who's in love, that individual shows the effects. This is as a scientist, this is one of the most reproducible, strongest effects I've seen in my whole career. So, I think, besides, we studied heartbreak also. There are so many aspects of this to know about. One of the things that I've come to look at it is it's important. It's know thy brain. So we've gotten to begin to know our brains. Know thyself. We are really learning about ourselves, I think, and as individuals, and we learn from writers about ourselves too. We learn, and it really what the brain is telling us about is, it's our behavior. So I'm a neuroscientist, so all behavior for me is based on the physiology, all right? Mm-hmm. And so what Garth talks about, I see very much as, in the physiological terms. And I think that Garth resonated too with this idea that it's a need and a motivation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Lucy. There is so much to talk about this, and I know that all of you sitting out there have resonated at least with some of what Lucy has said and some of what you heard Garth read. It's impossible not to, I think. But I want to begin a little bit with the process for you, Garth, of reading that article in 2005 and then, as a writer, beginning to be interested in the physiological base of love, but then also, and love is addiction in a way, but then also the layers and layers of complexity on that, and holding those two things simultaneously in the brain, in your brain. And so I just wanted you to react to that a little bit, and maybe Lucy can chime in as well on this kind of balance of knowing the animal self and what motivates the animal self, and then the layers of complexity we as humans layer on top of that.
Right. Well, it is one of the reasons why I think that love and desire and sex are, that whole complex of human response is a kind of uniquely fertile ground for the writer. Because it does seem to me that sort of sex and that intense act of communication that is sex sort of puts so much of the human under pressure. It is that moment where I think we are most animally engaged. I think it's also the moment where we have our most intense intimations of something that feels like spirit, of something that feels like transcendence. You know, I remember when I read that article in 2005, I was doing a PhD, I was studying poetry. And you know, I do think poetry is kind of a technology for the research and management of love. I mean, so, and you know, and I think that like maybe the most profound, so there's this little poem by Anacreon. I mean, you know, the Greeks sort of knew everything. And there's a poem that I know in Anne Carson's really brilliant translation, and it's so tiny, but it seems to me that it in sort of, it's like a little bomb of a poem. It just packs so much. So it's, with his huge hammer again, Eros knocked me like a blacksmith and doused me in a wintry ditch. And like, I think there's so much going on there. I mean, with his huge hammer, so already we have a sense of the scale of desire, of the scale of erotic response. That, I mean, it is kind of, I mean, it is the thing that seems to show us the dimensions of ourselves, what we can contain. With his huge hammer again, and that word again, that, I mean, it is something that happens and happens again, and it always feels like the first time, you know, is always unprecedented, but is, of course, I think, a kind of physiological response that can be, you know, that is a sort of repetitive response as well. With his huge hammer again, Eros knocked me. That love, and I mean, the reason that I think love is the best plot device is that it is something that happens to us. It's not something that we choose. It's something that sort of teaches us, again, when it gives us that sense of magnitude of scale, it also gives us the sense of how minuscule we are, and especially of how minuscule our wills are. Because love takes all of our agency away from us, and it ruins all of our plans. Which is why it's great for novels. And then with his huge hammer again, love knocked me like a blacksmith, which is an image of heat. Is an image of being put under an intense and transforming force and being shaped. With his huge hammer again, Eros knocked me like a blacksmith and doused me in a wintry ditch. And so you have that whole, I mean, the whole sort of Petrarchan system of contraries, of heat and cold, I freeze and burn, right? In that, but what is most profound is that it is an image of how love is also a profound experience of what Keats said poetry was, which is soul-making. And that, you know, that these are experiences that just profoundly form us. And that, you know, the reason love is so terrifying and exhilarating is that one is not the same after. That one has been made into something by this force that swamps our agency. I mean, that does, I think, you know, very early on, that did seem to me like sort of the subject. I mean, the subject. I mean, obviously it's not the subject. There are lots of subjects, like at least 5, death, love. But that love for me as an artist seemed like the subject. And then, of course, the ways in which sort of the particular experience of love, because, of course, I mean, what's marvelous about reading that article in 2005 and being like, oh, absolutely, that's what's happening. That's what Anacreon is talking about. I mean, that's, you know, now we can put ourselves in machines and see things light up and say, aha, that's the human, the sort of fundamental human animal response. And yet, of course, that response in ways that we are so far from understanding is filtered and shaped and given form through culture, through sort of the shapes that a particular historical moment gives for those responses. And I think about how, say, cruising, and how that shapes this particular response in a way that, one of the things that's fascinating to me about cruising is that it disarticulates in some ways. Desire, sex, love.
Right.
It separates out those things, and yet, like, it doesn't separate, it articulates, because at times they still touch. And one of the things that, the way in which I want to write about places like the bathrooms at the National Palace of Culture, is that I want to make clear, that the great poet of cruising is Walt Whitman. And one of the things that Whitman writes about, and it's cruising as a sort of metaphor for democracy, as a metaphor for how to exist in a city like New York, where you cannot know everyone. And yet where you must be bound to one another by a kind of affective response. And again and again in his poems, Whitman has the speaker moving through a crowd and having a profound connection with an individual that he singles out, and insisting, even when he says we are like two drops in an ocean that sort of come together and part and will never meet again, but insisting that that moment of connection has a value that is lyric in the sense that it is entirely separate from the value of duration. And I know that I have had moments cruising where I have had a profound experience of the personhood of another human being, even someone whose name I didn't know, even someone whom I would never see again. And yet I know that I've had moments in which all these little chambers of the brain light up, and where you do feel that sort of fullness of affective response. And it seems to me that is, the whole sort of gambit of everything I've written is the claim that value is not just profound, but infinite.
Yeah, and what is so interesting about that as well is that even in the scientific papers, in your papers, the seeking for metaphor and ways to describe and ways to understand this experience is so present. I said earlier, I was so struck in this paper when it reads, the way we describe ourselves in love is that we don't say that we step into love, we say we fall in love. And so we are already trying to capture in a scientific paper through a kind of literary device what the sort of an image of what our neuroanatomy is having us do. And so you can't even in a scientific paper, in a way, describe love without metaphor. Yeah?
Okay, right. I guess so. Yes. Well, we certainly.
I don't mean to upset you, Lucy. No.
So you bring up several things, but of course, one of the big unanswered questions scientifically that you bring up too, and so interesting, is why do we fall in love with who we do fall in love with?
Yeah.
There's one group that is trying to attack this problem, actually, with a speed dating kind of design and studying people, that first attraction. If you have 5 minutes to talk to the person, and then you go on and you check off whether you'd like to see them again.
It's cruising.
Yeah.
And by the way, one of the conclusions they come to in one of their first studies is that what the brain is doing at that time, because we would say opposites attract, some people say that, right? But this study, very early in kind of the whole investigation, suggests that what we're actually seeing and looking for is how we're similar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, so my colleague Art Aaron, and for many of the psychologists, the definition of romantic love and how it's different from sex is that it's a desire for emotional union. It's that strong desire for emotional union. It doesn't even sometimes have to involve sex at all. Usually it does, but for some people, they either rather be with the other person and be, and talk to them and find out what their mind is like before even though they are sexually attracted, but it's this desire for emotional union. It's so important that you can, I mean, the neuroscientists now talk, and social psychologists now talk about the social brain. And we're constantly, just when we walk down the street, especially in New York City, someone's coming towards you, what kind of shoes are they wearing, how are they walking, are they dangerous, are they not, and would they be attractive to you? I mean, we're doing it all the time, every moment, this social evaluation. So while cruising, that's for sure happening, and you get, I'm sure, this seeing something familiar, which can be in just a facial expression, and some people think it's the familiarity has to do with your many caregivers in your early life, but that's what's stimulating that. But this desire for emotional union, and then this belief, and a lot of what Aaron says romantic love is what he thinks it is. He calls it a rapid expansion of the self.
Yeah.
A rapid expansion of the self.
Right.
See?
Right. And by the way, and there's a whole brain system. It's amazing to me. I just love this stuff. There's now a neuroscience of relationships. Here we had so much trouble, in 1998, and now there's a neuroscience of relationships. But there are parts of the brain that, as I, as a somatosensory neuroscientist, know about just the concept of our body, as it's represented in our brain. And as a matter of fact, when we look at our romantic partners, we actually we're activating a part of the brain that represents our own bodies. We're kind of incorporating this other person into ourselves. And the more that they kind of expand our worldview, this seems to activate our reward system, and the more we're going to fall. Just this whole really unconscious level, reflex level system. That's why we fall, I think. Now, some people are capable of stepping into love. Some people are capable of this. Not a whole lot, by the way. But it's this, as I showed you, so do remember this brain stem. It's this primitive system. That's part of the whole problem. We can use this part of the brain. We can use this part of the brain to modulate these feelings and to modulate our behaviors around this. And this is something that I was interested in the book. So the narrator has, in a way, has kind of fallen in love. And wants more, asks for more than just paying for sex.
Right.
Wants a little bit more than that. But still has to keep a distance. And that's hard.
Yeah.
That's hard to do.
And that, you think, is the interplay between these two parts of the brain, where what part of the brain is modulating the frontal lobe?
Yes, this is the most developed part of the primate brain, and we as humans, right? It's more of the reasoning, self-control, taking in all the experiences, negative experiences and positive experiences, and weighing them. Very important for the decision making, but especially this self-control for, we want to rush toward the person when we, see them in the street, or just plan our whole life around them, and do nothing else. But we know you've got to go to work.
And so are you learning more about how to balance that modulation, or what the, how, asking for a friend. how those two parts of the brain can interplay successfully, Lucy.
Have you figured it out? Let us know.
Right, I wish. Actually, it was years ago when we started these experiments, there was a friend with, a former dean at NYU said, "Lucy, if you can figure this out." By the way, there are some good books and some good experiments about increasing the activity in these frontal lobes, especially it's the lateral prefrontal cortex, so important for this, for self-regulation of emotion. And I know this is going to sound strange, but it's a lot of what you can do. So some deep breathing, yeah, and there's something called heart math, but you can deep breathing and breathing into your heart, and just taking time each day to sit. So even mindful meditation does strengthen these lateral prefrontal cortical areas.
Did you say heart math?
Yes, I did.
It's fascinating. I also want to talk about the other side of this, which is so moving in what you read, Garth, which is the ends of things, the end of love and the immense difficulty of ending a kind of addictive love. I mean, all of us have had the experience, right, not personally, but with someone we know who is with someone who's obviously terribly bad for them, and they can't leave them. They can't let it go. They're acting quite like someone who's unable to quit smoking, or someone who's unable to quit an opiate addiction. So I wonder if you could both talk from both sides of the equation a little bit about that.
Well, I don't really have very much to say. It's interesting to me, though, that in some responses to the book, some people get actually very frustrated. I mean, I understand this with the narrator. He's a very frustrating person, but, they'll say, like, well, why does he keep going back to Midco? Like, why would he do this? What is this about? And I sort of find myself at a loss in responding to that, because I am sort of like, well, either you know or you don't. Like, either you've sort of had this experience of sort of, a love that is obviously a terrible idea, but that you can't let go of. And I find myself it's funny because reading, obviously I know absolutely nothing about neuroscience. Reading the sort of, like the research article that you sent to us to read, and also the New York Times, it does seem to me like we are still very much at the beginning of sort of trying to understand, like that the tools we have for, say, mapping response in the brain seem really still very much sort of at the beginning, in a very rudimentary place. And one of the things that I've remarked is the extent to which it seems like these experiments focus on visual stimuli. When, of course, like putting a picture in an MRI, when, of course, there's much more. To me, the visual is, in fact, not primary. That, smell is primary. Touch is primary. So, and then also, of course, all of the ways in which, the fact that a particular part of the brain is stimulated. You talked about the sort of difficulty in trying to understand, well, what is doing which stimulating, and how can we figure that out? Like, it does seem to me that one of the things that I think poetry as a mode of research into love gets right is a kind of modesty before love. And a kind of modesty before sort of the limitations of our own, of our knowledge. The limitations of our tools, whether poetry or an MRI, sort of the limited nature of it. But I do have to say, that said, I find quite compelling your argument that love is like addiction. Just as, as a sort of, just thinking of it in poetic terms as an analogy, it seems to me quite true just to the experience of love.
But it's more than an analogy, right?
I think it is.
It's a physiological reality. Yeah?
Yes. In fact, love is a natural addiction that
Right.
nature
Yeah, that seems
nature
just true to
designed
me.
us, for this addiction to each other. And it's so hard to give up, and there have to be really extenuating circumstances for us to give it up. And one of the other things that can make it so hard is, I love this quote from a psychologist who says, the distress of a romantic partner also activates our caregiving system, which I think in this case in the story is the same too. Mitko was constantly activating a caregiving system that was part of the narrator too, a very strong part. And so that makes it more complicated. And this caregiving system, it turns out, is also a very primitive system and uses this nucleus accumbens and the parts of the brain that are even identified in prairie voles, for pair bonding and taking care of each other. So, and again, this romantic love, and we're addicted to others, and part of it is because we take care of each other. And so that makes it even more complicated to give up the other person and another person who's in distress. And if you're the rejector, because we studied heartbreak too, but we studied the people who were rejected. But if you're the rejector and someone who's heartbroken, they're really in pain, and you are going to feel that, and it's going to affect you.
The two big metaphors that we have in popular music and poetry and in other forms for love is, one is this notion of addiction, right? And the other is the notion of insanity. I'm addicted to love, I'm crazy in love, one or the other. But I think your findings are leaning away from a dysfunction of the brain as related to, if I'm understanding it properly, as related to romantic love or sexual attraction, that it's not a dysfunction of the brain at all. It's unrelated to I'm crazy in love.
So good. So some people will call it crazy, and we do act a little crazy when we're in love, but we take risks.
Yeah.
But it looks like, but that's, again, sometimes you need to take a risk to be sure that the couple is going to stay together. It's a big risk, and you have to jump in, and you have to forget reasons sometimes. One of the things I'll tell you that does happen, one of the things we did too, one of the great students, the woman who went to Beijing, her hometown, and did the study for the Chinese population, another thing she wanted to do was follow up the people 4 years later. And so she had scanned them when they were in love, and she wanted to see, okay, 4 years later, who had broken up and who was still together, all right? And could you see any difference between the two? I said, oh, this one, no, there's no way we'll see it. But we went ahead and, analyzed the data, and yes. And guess what it was? This is pretty interesting. So the people who were still together had suppressed activity strongly in this prefrontal area, this reasoning part of the brain. So when I presented that data to a group of neurologists, because I'm from a neurology department, and once a year I give them a talk about romantic love, and they said, like lobotomy. So, yeah, but maybe we have to be a little crazy, because we do have to take some special risks to keep pursuing the person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that was your finding between success. What if a person is still with the person? You would say that's successful romantic love.
Right, and what it is, so what it turns out, the way we interpret it, the way it looks, and to summarize a whole lot of thinking and other people's data, is what we're doing when we suppress this activity in the frontal areas is we're suspending negative judgments. Remember I said how we're constantly judging others? We have this social brain. So as all of you who have ever been in a relationship for more than 6 months, and certainly if you've ever lived with someone else, you know that you have to do this sometimes. So, and there's a great psychologist named John Gottman who claims that he can interview a couple in the first 5 minutes. He knows whether they're going to make it or not. And the key thing he looks at is how much they're criticizing each other, or one is criticizing the other. So suspending negative judgment is an important part of keeping a relationship going, it seems, and the brain physiology. So it's really nice. I love it when the psychologists show us this, and then the brain physiology, corroborates this kind of finding. And this is something we should pay attention to probably when we've got these two pieces of data coming together. And,
Seems like you have a reaction to that, Garth.
Well, I feel very judged. No, but one of the things that strikes me is the way in which, and again, I know nothing. I just know nothing. But the way in which, I do wonder how much the interpretation of such findings might be influenced by one's own expectations of what one will find. For instance, the ways in which, the ways in which we're talking about these systems, it does sound as though we are describing a species that is hardwired for monogamy and devotion. And the research that is literature and also our lives would suggest, otherwise. And so I'm wondering, because so much of this sort of brain system that singles out and talking about pairing, whereas I think, as a gay man, I feel that, and my own experience of desire and sexuality and romantic love has not been that, and that in fact, there are sort of sustained models of affective and sexual relationship that are not.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That are
So because we've been studying the other more,
right.
that's why I've been talking about it.
Right.
But
talk about promiscuity.
So I can talk about promiscuous prairie voles and how they're so different.
Good. I like that. Yeah.
And how their brains are very different from the pair bonding prairie voles, and that
So within the species, there's sort of
different
yes,
brains.
and it turns out, and to make a long story short, many of these findings have been kind of confirmed in humans too, but it's a vasopressin receptor in your ventral pallidum. Yeah.
What does that mean? What part lights up?
No.
That's as good as I can do.
No, it's a very important point. I think what I hope for all of this, they talk about individualized medicine now for cancer treatments and that kind of thing. But for kind of the way we relate to others and what our romantic relationships are like, and the way we interact with others for shorter or longer amounts of time, really appears to depend a lot, certainly on our past experience, no doubt about it, but also on our genetic makeup and the distribution and concentration, say in this one instance, of our vasopressin and oxytocin receptors. Yeah. So it'd be good, I hope in the future, a lot of us, can go and get a profile, when we're 18. So that we know whether we're going to have so that we know that whether we're going to have a tendency to want to, be pair bonding or promiscuous, and accept it.
Yeah. Right. Avoid a lot of suffering.
Yes.
And get everyone else to accept it.
That's it, and to get everyone else to accept it.
Right.
Can I ask, do we know what friendship looks like in the brain?
A little bit, yes.
And how it relates to romantic love?
Right. It overlaps, but
Yeah.
it's somewhat different. Yeah, it's different.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, maternal love and romantic love have overlapping but different areas are active too.
If it's okay with both of you, I imagine that people in the audience may have some questions as well. Could I open it to the audience for some questions? Oh, someone immediately wants to go first. Yeah, that's rare.
I wondered what love has to do with dopamine. Then supposedly there are different parts of your brain that the dopamine goes in different places, and then the way that you get it addictive is, like you said, the brain stem. You do the mindfulness, and they've tried it with alcoholics and drugs people, and it works.
Right, it helps, yeah. But it's romance and dopamine are probably very closely related. So no one's ever. It takes a high, a lot of radioactivity and injecting in people to absolutely pinpoint this conclusion. But what I pointed to here, this ventral tegmental area in the brainstem, supplies 80% of the dopamine in the brain. All right, so romantic love and dopamine are very closely related, probably, and that's the whole thing with it. It's very much like the drugs of abuse that release dopamine, and it's a very difficult system to control. But again, it's this deep breathing, it's this mindful meditation, it's being able to be a little more relaxed that maybe can give us a little more control over it.
And yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I'm interested in either, however you conceptualize it, either jealousy or suffering. In other words, Proustian love.
Ooh.
What?
Someone who speaks my language, thank you.
So tell me what you mean by Proustian love.
What do we mean by Proustian love?
Well, love that is provoked, in fact, provoked by jealousy, and then also, in order to survive, re-engenders jealousy.
And so you need to have, someone else out there competing, right, to get that feeling back. So,
Or the suspicion of
That.
possibilities, yes.
right.
In other words, impending loss.
So I can't speak.
I could go on, but
So I wish I could speak more to, I wish there were more data. There aren't. But certainly, separation, absence makes the heart grow fonder. Separation when there are barriers, when there are any kind of barriers, and maybe another person who's going to interfere with the relationship, or when there are barriers, it really can increase these feelings of romantic love. But we have, I don't know how the brain is reacting or what it's doing in those situations.
So a question, I mean, the idea that dopamine and that sort of, there's a pleasure response to love seems true.
Very important.
And a lot of poetic research would suggest that that's true. But then also the idea that love can provoke sadness. That, I mean, to me, that sort of Proustian love or Keatsian love is the idea that inherent in the experience of love is the intimation of its loss, which seems to me quite different from the sort of euphoria of a sort of dopamine flooding the brain.
But Lucy, is that more in the realm of psychology and environment than it is of neuroanatomy?
So this is totally my interpretation of this, or from what I know, I would say I think is likely, which is it's a habit that has been set up in the person's experience in life, and that, as a matter of fact, you say, and yes, it involves, and there is pain in it, but the reward system is there too, and if your experience has been when you're feeling love, but then to be rejected, and it becomes associated with pain, then it's a new habit that's set up. And habits involve the release of dopamine and the reward system. And if the habit becomes these feelings of attraction towards something, and then being rejected, and it's attraction, rejection, and that becomes the pattern, then I think that's how it happens.
Queer melancholy.
Yes, we had a question there.
Hi, I wanted to ask you, Lucy, about, I think it was about a year ago, there was that story in the New York Times that went super viral and everybody was sharing
The
it.
39 questions?
Yeah. I was wondering, what do you think about that? It said that if two people sit down and they ask each other these 39 intimate questions, they can fall in love with each other. Was that who wrote that and what was that based on, anything?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, it was. And I was thinking, when you were talking about cruising and that moment of intimacy, and you can look into a person's eyes, right? And you feel an intimate moment. So, indeed, it was Art Aaron who was trying to see if he could make people fall in love. And he set up an experiment at Stony Brook, and the writer of that New York Times article was a student in his class when he described this experiment. And what they did was they brought in students and they made up these questions. Their idea was that falling in love involved greater and greater intimacy. That the more intimate you became, the more you would be attracted to someone. And that really romantic love is this intimacy and establishing intimacy. And again, this idea that what we want, a lot of what many of us want is emotional union. So they came up with these questions so they would become progressively more and more intimate. People would have to reveal more about themselves. And the end of the experiment, at the end, they had people look into each other's eyes for, I think it's 3 minutes without looking away, which is actually a very difficult thing to do. And it turns out for that experiment that Art Aaron carried out, they had, I don't know, maybe 20 couples, 20 to 30 couples or something. One of the couples did, in fact, fall in love, but most of them didn't. But this writer remembered that experiment, looked it up, and decided, she, by the way, she is one of the ones, I think, who likes this idea of stepping into love.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a very interesting thing. It was a New York Times article that was shared something like 4 million times. It was incredible. People really have tried it and used it, and with some success. And she's given several TED Talks about her experience, and she's still with the guy. She tried it out with someone, and they're still together. and she gives a wonderful talk, by the way. I suggest Googling 39 questions or on TED, the TED website. They're very good talks, and it's a very interesting discussion, different view of romantic love, stepping into it rather than.
And you had a
falling into
question.
it.
Yeah, I was wondering, and this may not be based in any amount of research, but talking about the emotional connection that people need from romantic love, I noticed that that emotional connection is one of the reasons people read. And so I just wondered if there was maybe any way you guys could talk about why people read or what it is that brings people to literature for that connection.
For a kind of a emotional connection to literature.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Have any idea?
I'll just say that I think that is exactly why we go to literature. I mean, certainly I feel like, the way in which poetry is a very profound kind of therapy really is that it, it lessens the quotient of solitude in some way, that one does feel, to me, the thing that literature does better than anything else is that, literature is, I think, the best technology we have for communicating the experience of another person's consciousness. I don't think anything else can do that. And I think, it's the best technology we have for communicating what another life feels like from the inside. And the sort of extraordinary thing that I feel like is entirely confirmed by these experiments is that, that alchemy, that sort of extraordinary force that literature has of, by rooting us in the particular, arriving at an experience of the universal. This is why I read, to read a book by someone whose life is entirely different from mine and to feel that it is teaching me profound lessons about myself. It is a gambit, I think, of this, of my own book, to sort of say that this relationship that in many of its particulars might seem quite alien to many readers, of cruising, of a relationship that begins in the bathroom, of a relationship that begins with a transaction, of a relationship that never has any pretensions of exclusivity or monogamy, but that, or of duration, but that indeed, I hope very much, the reason I wrote the book is because I hope that it does say something about what is kind of fundamental to our experience of desire and of love. Mm-hmm. And and the fact that these structures are so deeply embedded in the brain, the fact that they are so profoundly shared, does give me hope that writers are not entirely deluded in that belief that we can, again, not by sort of effacing difference or specificity or by minimizing it, but instead by rooting into it, arrive at what is universal. Mm-hmm. I don't know, do you think your experiments prove that? Because to me it seems,
Yes, I do. Yes. Yeah, there's a core system we can all tap into, but we have these different ways, and it's very important to see the different ways, and to see each other's experience, and then to understand each other better.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm curious about the title. Could you
Yes.
tell us a little bit
Me
about the
too,
title?
I wanted to know.
Well, in some sense it kind of relates to that. In some sense what belongs to you, the idea of what is common between us, it's a quotation, although no one would ever, it's an allusion which no one could ever know unless I told them. But it's an allusion to Death in Venice, to Thomas Mann's Death in Venice, which is a book that I think is very obviously kind of beneath this book. And it's the moment when Aschenbach is in love, and he is acting in, love has entirely disordered his habits of self. Mm-hmm. And he has gone to the barber, and the barber is trying to convince him to allow him to make cosmetics on him and to dye his hair to make him look young, because the barber says, I see you're in love. Let me help this. Which is also an interesting thing, that we can see it in other people, which in Bulgaria, so I had an experience of falling in love. And I remember, and it was very early, I couldn't sleep and all of it. It was really that sort of disordered time. And there was this really nice guy who worked in the coffee room at my school, who I would sort of chat with. And he looked at me and he said, you look tired. And I said, yeah, I'm tired. It's, so much work. I said, "Imam mnogo работы." I have lots of work. And he said, you're in love. And I felt so exposed. I was like, I didn't know. But it's interesting. But so the barber sees, he tells Aschenbach, you're in love. He says, permit me to restore what belongs to you. Uh-huh. And that phrase feels to me so redolent, not just of love, or not just of youth, rather, but instead of like longings of all kinds. Longing for that expansiveness that the experience of falling in love gives you. And then the other meaning of the phrase is something a little different that actually gets into what you were talking about before in terms of kind of learned response and the way in which a learned response affects our experience of love. The spark for the book was really this weird and vertiginous experience, and I know some of you in the room have heard me say this before, but of being in this very foreign place, Bulgaria, and it felt sort of forcibly thrust back into memories of the place from which I come, and the place which I fled when I was 16, which is Kentucky. And, I think, in some sense, I think I wrote the book to try to understand that. And what I came to understand, especially working with young people in Bulgaria and being the only openly gay person in my school community, also being the only openly gay person almost any of my students had ever met in real life. And so they would come, students who knew that they were queer or thought they might be queer would come to talk to me. And I remember listening to their stories and feeling almost trapped in them. Because for all of the differences between Bulgaria in the 20 teens and Kentucky in the early 90s, as they told me their stories, I felt very much that they were telling me my own story. And that there was a similar horizon of possibility drawn across their lives. This was also the experience I had when I found the bathrooms beneath the National Palace of Culture, very early in my time in Bulgaria, and had the most bizarre experience of sort of above ground being almost incapable of saying anything, of any kind of communication, and descending into this subterranean space and finding I was entirely fluent, because the codes of cruising were exactly the same as the codes I learned in the parks of Kentucky when I was 14. And so, but I realized that these are both places where queer people are taught certain lessons about their lives. And that lesson, which my students had learned in the same way that I learned it, was that their lives lacked value and their lives lacked dignity. And in some sense, the sort of deep subject of the book is sort of what belongs to us that we cannot set aside when one is taught those lessons. My book is a book about shame and about queer shame, but I think a very different kind of queer shame than, say, Baldwin in Giovanni's Room. Because my narrator has been steeped in the language of queer activism for decades. He knows that the lessons he was taught are false, really knows that, and really does feel that. And yet he is still someone who was shaped by those lessons. And he will never get to be someone who was not taught those lessons about himself. He'll never get to be that person. And so in that sense, what belongs to you? So I hope that the phrase allows kind of both, access to both, to that sort of expansive, euphoric feeling of love and desire, and then also to that feeling of having been exiled from that expansiveness.
We have time, I think, for two more questions. In the back?
Yeah.
Oh, way in the back. Yeah?
Hi, thanks. Two phenomena I like to differentiate are lust and attachment.
Lust and passion
Attachment,
and attachment.
and you could even throw in a third, which would be like intimacy, like intimate connection. I wonder if, you could talk about 39 questions, talk about cruising, talk about reading, how each of you, if you would, differentiate these.
Lust, attachment, intimacy. Those three things?
Yeah. And do they and they're all functioning in the same areas of the brain?
Well, just behaviorally, we know they're very different. And you can feel lust for someone, on a movie screen. Pornography, you can feel lust. It's no one, and you feel the lust, but it's no one you would ever say feel intimate with, and you can know that. And attachment. So as a matter of fact, as I think I mentioned, so Helen Fisher's whole thing about the human reproductive strategy, it's lust, attraction, or this romantic love, and attachment. And attachment usually involves some intimacy. But we've certainly done some studies in which we asked the same person to have, think about their feelings of lust for someone, their feelings of romantic love for someone, and their feelings of attachment, and to think about those different scenarios. And it activates different brain systems, and of course it would, because we're feeling different things when we feel just lust, and when we're feeling that warm, cuddly, as they say it, oxytocin cuddle hormone attachment. It's a very different feeling. And so if you're going to have a very different feeling about something, you're going to have a different brain system at work. And yes, we can identify different things.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
And yet, you know, that research that is literature tells us we can also feel all of them at once. And I mean, the thing that is interesting to me, I mean, in some sense, we were talking about how, you know, even in these scientific papers, we have to use metaphor. And I mean, you know, in some sense, one of the problems is just the inadequacy of language. I mean, what, you know, Elliot Sweeney says, I've got to use words when I talk to you, you know, and that's part of the human problem. But, you know, one of the things that I think, like that, the reason we have poetry is because we have to try to make language do more than language can do. And it seems to me that Anacreon, he really gets it right. And the thing that is so fascinating to me about desire and about the experience of actually any of those things you say is that they all seem to me to resonate with all the others. And to me, I mean, while there is that euphoric experience of love, I think the primary attraction of which is a kind of certainty or wholeheartedness that we almost never experience. It's actually, to me, what seems not just the experience of love, but also kind of a fundamental human condition is ambivalence. Mm-hmm. Not ambivalence in the sense of like mushy feeling, but ambivalence in the sense of equally weighted contrary impulses. So that, you know, it seems to me profoundly true when Petrarch says, I freeze and burn. It seems to me profoundly true when Catullus says, I hate and love. It seems to me profoundly true that the relationship between the narrator and Mitko is one that engages these feelings and impulses of caregiving and is also at the same time predatory. Mm. And that desire can sort of evacuate personhood and turn a human person into an object, right? We know that that's something that desire can do. And desire can also elevate personhood and allow us to see that sort of human face more intensely than we do otherwise, which was why Audre Lorde thought in a, you know, romantic notion to which I subscribe, that erotic desire is our best chance of sort of leaping over gulfs of difference. Mm-hmm. It just seems to me that it is all of those things. And one of the things I'm thinking about in terms of the technology, like, you know, it does seem to me that maybe, and again, I know nothing, but that maybe we are still quite far away from a technology that can adequately show us what that ambivalence looks like or what it's made of.
Right, it's certainly, you're right, and all those things are going on. No, we can probably actually track those things going on at the same time.
Mm-hmm. It's very rare that I am able to sit on a stage with two such brilliant people. I hope that you will join me in thanking them, you'll buy a book, and you'll stay a bit to talk with them. Thank you.